In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt did not run for president again. He allowed Secretary of War William Taft to run. Taft won in the 1908 election. And in that time, Roosevelt decided he wanted to run again, but he had already sort of left the Republican Party, so he ran on a third party ticket, the Progressive Party. But in the election of 1912, Woodrow Wilson is elected rather than the former President Roosevelt. Wilson is very different than his predecessors, McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft. Um, Wilson, just from his looks, he always looks a bit like a professor to me. And what we have seen with McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft is that they were sort of all cut from the same cloth, believe in imperialism, in American power. Wilson is much more mild-mannered. He doesn't see that it is our responsibility to do these things, nor is it in our interest. We need to take care of ourselves first. And so he's what you would call an isolationist. One example where he sort of doesn't hesitate to act, however, is with our neighbors to the south, Mexico. Mexico had been in the midst of a little bit of a revolution, and a new leader takes over. And Wilson refuses to accept or to legitimize this new ruler because he says they weren't chosen by the Mexican people in a legitimate means. Now, at this time, former President Taft and former President Roosevelt are in the Congress, and so they are trying to pass these bills and get America to be involved. Wilson doesn't want to, but he does finally get involved when American troops are threatened on the border. So we see that he has these principles, but if push comes to shove, he will get involved. And that's what's going to happen with the First World War. Now, those of you who are at Oaks for sophomore history, this will be very familiar. We're going to breeze through this. For those of you that need a bit of a refresher or who weren't here sophomore year at Oaks, I have put links to the sophomore class videos on these lessons if you want to get a bit more information. But what we talk about is the main causes of the First World War. Militarism is the first one. We have seen with industrialization that these countries can have bigger and bigger militaries, and this is a way for them to demonstrate their power. It also relates back to social Darwinism, that the strongest will survive. And how do you demonstrate you're the strongest? By having the best and the strongest military. A is for alliances. I refer to this as the issue of the friendship bracelets, that all of these alliances had been built, some secret, many not, and we end up with two teams, the Central Powers, which is Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, versus the Triple Entente, which is Britain, France, and Russia. I is for imperialism and economics. This goes back to the colonies that we've been talking about. Having colonies, having territories around the world would give respect and power to the European mother countries that had them. But this can result in rivalry, in this case, particularly between Britain and Germany. By 1900, even though Britain has been the best, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And even though Germany is a relatively new country, they only became a modern country in 1871. By 1900, Germany's economy is outperforming Britain's. So this now becomes a competition of power. But where does that leave the U.S.? We also, like Germany, we were a new country, but we have industrialized and we have built up our military power, like Roosevelt did with the Great White Fleet. And N stands for nationalism, this national pride, showing off that you're the best in various ways. And this relates specifically to France and Germany. In 1870, in the Franco-Prussian War, Germany had taken a French territory called Alsace-Lorraine. France wants it back. But Germany says we're the best, we're the most powerful. Too bad. The other issue is with the Slavs, an ethnic group in Eastern Europe, and their sort of protector country would be Russia, also a Slavic country, but they are the largest and most politically legitimate. as well as with the Ottomans. So this is all taking place in the Balkan Peninsula. These Slavic peoples were under other empires' control, whether it be the Ottomans or the Austro-Hungarian, and that will cause some tension in this very diverse part of the world. All of these tensions, all of these long-term causes result in war. In June of 1914, when the Crown Prince of Austria, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. He was a Serbian nationalist. He is Slavic, and Ferdinand was very forward-thinking, realized that many of the Serbians and other Slavic people groups in the Balkans under Austrian control did not like being under Austrian control. So Ferdinand was interested in cooperating with these groups and potentially giving them more autonomy, giving them more rights. But the Serbian nationalist groups, the ones who wanted that independence, they want full independence. Particularly, Serbia wants to get Bosnia back under its control. If the Bosnian Serbs were given more rights under Ferdinand's rule, they probably wouldn't have an interest in joining Serbia. So Gavrilo Princip is sent by the Serbian government and assassinates Ferdinand. This enacts the secret alliances. So Austria is at this time pretty weak, pretty small, and it looks to its ally, Germany. Serbia is very weak and very small, so it looks to its ally, Russia. And this whole tangle of alliances is what ultimately will cause this war. So here we see these alliances. Ultimately, Germany is called out by France. And Germany says, France, mind your business. So Germany is going to try and get to France, but to do that, it's going to go through Belgium. And when it does that, it will enact an alliance between Belgium and Britain. And so now we have all of these countries involved in the First World War. Now, when this happens, President Wilson's response, while all of this is developing, is that, quote, every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality, which is the spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned. So Wilson has no interest in being involved. This is not America's war. This is a European issue. So Wilson really does want to maintain American neutrality. We already have our own issues in our own country, as well as some of these new territories or quote-unquote colonies that we have obtained in the last 20 years. However, even with this official neutrality, there is kind of an understanding that we side with the Triple Entente, with Britain, France, and Russia. Now, even though this is not official, this is not done with any documents, it happens through trade. America sees an opportunity to benefit from war by selling arms, so we can use our industrial power to produce material or goods that these countries need in order to fight war. We sell these arms, but we only sell them to the British, not because the Germans don't want to, but the British had established a blockade preventing German ships from being able to trade with America. So it seems like we are kind of siding with the Triple Entente. Now, I'm sure you are aware or you will remember from last year's history class that trench warfare is really what makes this war's issues either happen or the responses to these issues. We have a few fronts. There is the Eastern Front in Russia and Germany. There is the Western Front here in France and Germany, as well as down in the Mediterranean. But most of this war really took place in France, and this is where all these trenches were. They started off very, very simple. They got more advanced the longer that the war went on. You can see in this aerial shot how the trenches were connected in order to have supply routes. And then in the middle, that large dark area, that would be no man's land, the separation between the two sides. Because of this style of warfare, it was when the Germans were trying to reach Paris, they don't want to retreat all the way back to Germany, but they do want protection, so they dig these trenches. Ultimately, though, trench warfare leads to stalemate, because if both sides are literally underground, that then your efforts won't be able to harm the enemy. So these armies start using more and more advanced or more and more damaging weapons. So we're going to see how artillery becomes bigger and better. Here is a big Bertha. It had a range of several miles. We have gas attacks, and as well as the addition of planes into warfare. And all of this modern technology is going to conflict with what is essentially a very traditional mindset of warfare, that you need to cover ground and you need to capture the capital. But when you have all of these modern weapons, ultimately it will lead to stalemate and then what we call shell shock, which in modern times we call PTSD. The sound, the effect of these weapons had such an impact on the individuals who were fighting in this war. So here's that British blockade I was talking about, the one that was preventing the Germans from trading with America. Eventually, the Germans figure out a way to skirt around or avoid, or perhaps I should say skirt under the blockade, and that is with U-boats, or the full name is Unterseeboot, which means underwater boat or undersea boat. This is a precursor of the modern submarine. For the British, they tried to make it as difficult as possible for civilian passengers to travel on the Atlantic. For the Americans, I love this ad that the Germans are posting in the newspaper, hey, watch out, there is a status of war between Britain and Germany. Any boats flying the flag of Great Britain or her allies are liable to be shot or to be torpedoed. And this is what we would call unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans are not just restricting their targets to military targets, but to anyone who is flying the flag of their enemy. The biggest example of this would be the Lusitania. This was a boat that left New York, it was on its way to England, and in April of 1915, it was hit by a German U-boat with a torpedo and sunk. And about 200 Americans were on that boat, but it was mostly British civilians. Now, the Germans said they shot it down because there was intelligence that there was ammunition on that boat, therefore it was in a combat situation. That is probably the case. The British would put materiel on civilian vessels as a way to transport them. Now, many people called for America to join the First World War with the sinking of the Lusitania. But Wilson really wants to stay isolated and stay neutral. And this is his campaign platform in 1916. Here's his campaign poster. He kept U.S. out of war. By 1916, it's pretty clear that this war is really devastating. It's having a much bigger impact than people originally thought. Many thought it would be over in a matter of months, but because of stalemate, it is lasting years longer. There was public support to bring the U.S. into the war with the Lusitania, but the big event that will cause the U.S. to finally join, in addition to Lusitania, is the Zimmerman Note, or the Zimmerman Telegram. This was a communication between Germany and Mexico. And it is essentially saying that Mexico, please join the German war effort. And when you do, and when our team is victorious, we will declare war on America and we will give back the territories that you lost in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the Mexican-American War. This is now enough of a threat for the United States to seriously consider going to war with Germany. This is now a threat in our backyard, and our territories, our states, are being threatened. But war can only be declared by Congress, so this becomes a big debate on a national level. And Jeannette Rankin was a congresswoman. She voted against war. She said, you can no more win a war than you can win an earthquake. And she was trying to convince people that war was not the answer. She was not the only one who opposed going to war. There were 50 other members of Congress who voted with her. But she was the one who was singled out for public derision and to be sort of the face of people who were risking America's safety. Ultimately, Congress does vote to go to war, and that happens in April of 1917. So now that the U.S. has declared war, we have to get ready for war. And that means the economy is going to have to adapt in order to produce the materiel that the Army and Navy and the Marines will need. But it also means that civilians, there will have to be some changes to their lives as well. A lot of this is going to be done by the War Industries Board. This was a new organization that was created, and its purpose was to make sure that all resources necessary were put towards the war effort, that private companies were doing what they could to help win this war, whether that meant producing the goods that would be needed, or just encouraging civilians to partake in the war effort. Sometimes that meant reducing your energy intake, reducing your coal. And that's what would ultimately lead to daylight savings time. Now, this had been proposed by Benjamin Franklin over a century earlier, but it wasn't used until the First World War. The reason for this was to reduce coal consumption so that could be used for the war effort. So when you fall back, if it is 5 o'clock and it's already getting dark, if you fall back, it's now 4 o'clock, you have 1 more hour of sunlight. Now the War Industries Board, or the WIB, it was functioning all right for its first year. But President Wilson wanted someone who would be even more efficient and effective. So he looked to one of his major campaign financiers, Bernard Baruch. And he was a Wall Street guy, very, very successful. And he takes over the War Industries Board to make it even more effective. He's also going to be important in making sure that the industries who are supplying the U.S. war effort stay at work. Now, this was a major time for unions in their growth because they had a bargaining chip. The U.S. needed their efforts, and union members wanted to be protected. However, the government did not want to risk losing productivity, losing work days. So collective bargaining became an essential element of labor's relationship with the government to come to an agreement so that both parties could be satisfied enough in order to keep the country working for the war effort. However, there are lots of workers who ended up joining the war effort. So this leads to the Great Migration. As northern industrial cities are losing their workers to join the military, this is an opportunity for African Americans to move from the American South into these major cities in order to take those jobs, to keep the country at work. So here you can see what that migration looks like. These major cities in the Northeast are seeing a huge influx of African Americans. And ultimately, this will lead to something we talk about in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance, and some other cultural shifts in the United States.